Hey, what's going on, everybody? Latest edition of my Cowboys vlog. So this one's going to be pretty much all scouting reports, or at least my scouting reports. I'm on the offensive line this week. Last week, if you recall, I did a quarterback and a couple of wide receivers. So as always, feel free to click on my Cowboys vlog playlist, and also feel free to subscribe. But anyway, this week is offensive line, so I did one tackle, one guard, and a center. Didn't really choose the guys who were projected the top half of the first round. Kind of was looking for more from there and below. So they might not all be guys you've heard of, but you will have heard at least of one for sure because he's been talked about in terms of the guard class. But I'm going to start with the tackle. I went with Billy Turner, offensive tackle out of North Dakota State. If you remember last week when I did my mock draft simulator, I picked him, I think it was in the third round, because there wasn't really any highly rated positions. I'd heard his name a couple of times and it seemed like a good place to take value on him. So I actually decided to take the time to watch some film on him this week and just kind of see where his game was at from my point of view. Being North Dakota State, smaller school, not a whole lot of tape out there to find. Luckily, though, North Dakota State played Kansas State this year, so at least he got some Division I competition, which is what I was hoping to find. And I'll tell you, I was very, very impressed with him. Good size. One thing that's apparent about him off the bat, when you watch him in this game against Kansas State, his foot speed, the way he can do his side steps, against the rushers. And his movement skills are very impressive. Now, Kansas State doesn't exactly have a lot of elite pass rushers, but being that they are Division I, it's obviously a step up in competition. And the way he held up and he's a left tackle, the way he held up was very impressive against the pass rush. Also, when he's doing run blocking, when he gets his hands on a guy and he can start driving them, they're pretty much gone. He was consistently driving his man to this, at least to the second level on run blocking. The other thing I was impressed with what he did, he didn't go out and chase his blocks. What I mean by that is he held his ground and held his position, and he didn't leave his, assigned area to go and, hunt his man down for a block or try and get to him. He waited for his man to come to him so he could block him there, which I thought was really good. If he ever gets on a linebacker, the linebacker's done. He's basically on the ground, especially in this game, which was very nice. His understanding of the scheme and technique was good. You saw him do some good combo blocking with his left guard. Didn't really have a whole lot of plays where he did pulls, where he pulled, but when he did, the movement speed was fairly good and but it was pretty apparent it was best if you don't usually use him on pulls, because he seemed to struggle a little bit being able to get around. Especially, they had him pulling to the right a lot of times, and that was a long way to go. I would have liked to see more examples of him maybe pulling around the tight end to the left on running plays. Didn't really see any examples of that, so they had him pulling very long ways. And he wasn't as effective there. He couldn't really get into his base as much and really get into blocks as he was when he was just in his position. So that was a little bit of a knock on him. Probably the only thing I saw that was a little bit off was he would have a tendency at times, and this was only sporadically, where he'd kind of overextend his arms a little bit, and he'd kind of almost reach out too far. And that would kind of get him a little bit slightly off balance. And I think against some more elite pass rushers, they would have taken advantage of that, to get a good swim move, or a rip to get around him. So that's probably something he'll need to be coached up on. A couple of times also then when they were doing some wham blocks where he'd cut inside to try and knock the defender down, he'd lunge a little bit too soon and he'd end up on the ground. The play that I saw in particular, when he lunged at the defender, he basically just completely missed him and he lost his footing. The guy wasn't able to make the play, but in especially at the NFL level, that could be a dangerous thing with some of the defensive ends and defensive tackles he'd be going up against in the pros. Basically, the only time I ever saw the man that he was specifically blocking and get anywhere close to the quarterback, he was left on an island to block his man and a rusher from the outside, and he still was able to get enough of a hand on his guy to slow him down enough for the quarterback to get the ball off. So it was still an impressive thing, but that was really the only time his man ever got close. So I'd say, especially considering the fact that K-State was, even though not a great team this last year, they were still Division I. Very impressive against Division I competition. The only other thing I would have liked to have seen, which, there's no reason for the school to have done this, but he was only doing the left tackle, so I would have liked to see him on the right side. Because I'm going from the mindset of where he could fit with the Cowboys, and obviously he's not going to take over for Tyron Smith on the left side. But potentially maybe he could play on the right side, depending on what happens with Doug Free. I think he showed, from his game tape that I've seen, he probably wouldn't have an issue at all switching to the right side. Obviously there would be the issues of, you're obviously slide stepping to the left when you're a left tackle, whereas you'd be doing everything on the opposite on the right side, so we'd be kind of getting used to that. But I think he could do it. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised, given the way that he looked, if he wouldn't be able to maybe fill in at some guard positions potentially, because he does have very nice power, especially in the run games, and he can hold his ground very well and get good knee bend and leverage. So yeah, overall against K-State, very impressive. I also watched a game against Delaware State, kind of given equal levels of competition. Basically, a lot of the same observations I made against K-State. Good movement skills, good feet, good power. Basically, this one was complete domination against Delaware State, which kind of what you'll always say when you're talking about Division II or lower guys is, do they dominate their level? And this guy, at least in this game that I saw, he dominated against his level. Really, the only thing I ever saw was you still saw a little bit of the overextension reach on the arms, and not getting good enough bend at times and being a little bit too upright, which didn't hurt him in this game, but against higher competition could be something they could exploit. So, but that's, obviously that's a coaching thing, and this guy doesn't seem to have enough issues where it wouldn't be a problem. So that's kind of what I saw on him. I've initially kind of looked at him as maybe a third-round guy, mostly because he's smaller school. After watching this, and obviously I have no connections with teams or scouts or anything like that, but it wouldn't shock me in the slightest if he fell, or if he rose himself up to maybe sneaking into a mid to late second rounder. Probably going to depend kind of how the draft falls, what positions maybe get a run somewhere in the second round. I still think wide receiver at the end of the first, early second is going to have a run. Probably you'll see some defensive backs somewhere in there, and there's a lot of high level offensive tackles in this draft that are going to go in the top 20. So it'll be interesting to see where that next run on tackles kind of happens. Obviously, he won't be in the first round, probably wouldn't be in the second one, but if anything starts happening in the mid to late second round to the early third, I think that's where you might see this guy. Definitely somebody, if he's there in the third round when the Cowboys are picking, that, depending on what we've done with the first two picks, I would have no hesitation turning in the card for this guy. Because again, we don't know what's going to happen with Free. We don't know how much longer Bernardo's going to be there, and the issues with Leary's knee. And I do think this guy could probably play guard if he had to, but definitely could play tackle. And it's never a bad thing to have a good backup swing guy that could maybe take over in the long run. So Billy Turner from North Dakota State, definitely a guy. Keep your eyes out on him. When I went to the guard, this would be the name most people are familiar with, Xavier Su'a-Filo from UCLA. Basically, I know he's kind of a more highly rated guy, kind of been projected anywhere from mid-first to early second. But he's a name that I've heard on some draft shows and different podcasts being, maybe a Cowboy target. So I decided to take a look at him because I've never actually watched him. obviously being in the Pac-10, he's facing some pretty good teams, some good defenses. So I watched his game against Arizona State and against Stanford. One thing I noticed, this is against Arizona State, he's a very powerful guy at the point of attack. Holds up really well. I don't really see him getting driven back. He pretty much faced Will Sutton, the defensive tackle from Arizona State, the majority of this game. You take that with a slight grain of salt because Will Sutton had a down year for his standards this year. But Su'a-Filo basically handled him the entire game. He was very impressive pulling. This guy was able to pull with ease and get around very well and get onto the blockers. Also thought he showed some good recognition of kind of what the defense was doing. Good peripheral vision, where he was able to easily pass off his man so that he could pick up a late blitzer, which sometimes you'll see some guards kind of be late on and they'll kind of miss the guy. And he was able to do that pretty well. And this game actually gave us kind of a unique look at him because the left tackle ended up getting hurt in this game, and they slid Su'a-Filo over to left tackle pretty much somewhere around midpoint of the second quarter, and he played the entire rest of the game at left tackle. So I got to see film of him at guard and tackle. So I'd encourage you to watch that game and see how he does. And it really wasn't too much of a slide or a slip for him in performance when he switched over to tackle. You could tell that he doesn't spend a lot of time at tackle because when he was doing his slide steps, to kind of intercept the rushers, he wasn't quite as smooth in his footwork. Because obviously as a guard, he's not worrying about that. But so, technique-wise, he wasn't as good at tackle as he was at guard. But he was still able to, maintain his technique as far as getting bend, getting leverage on the defender. Sometimes he got a little high in his stance, which could be a problem. But again, he's going to be a guard most of the time, mostly, so that's not going to be as big of an issue. Because you could obviously see he was better in tight quarters. Obviously where the guards are at the interior. A little bit more of a struggle when he's out in space. So you could see that pretty well. I would definitely say if he was to play any time at tackle, right tackle would be better for him, where he's not dealing with quite as much of the speed elite rushers as he would on the left side. If he's ever moving forward, especially on run blocking, gets his hands on a guy, that guy's out of the play. This guy just does not let him go. It's very similar to the way we started to see Tyron do in his position, is when he gets his hands on a guy, they're pretty much wiped out. And that you saw that a lot with this guy. So overall, very good performance against Arizona State. As a guard, I think he was a dominating force in this game. Left tackle, not great, but very solid. If you look at the stats for UCLA in this game, it's not going to look good because their quarterback got sacked a ton, but the pressure never came from his man. It was always the other side. So the stats might be a little deceiving at first, but watch the tape and you'll see that this guy was just a monster. And then against Stanford, again, good strength at the point of attack. He was consistently driving his man back to the second level. Similar to what I said about Billy Turner, if this guy gets his hands on a linebacker, it's not even fair. The linebacker may as well just go home. And he showed very good quickness getting to the second level when he would, block his man and then move on to the linebacker. Very quick doing that. He had one play early on where he got overextended and kind of wasn't in the right position on a block, and he wasn't able to, and this was on a stunt. The defensive end came and did a game with the tackle, and he came and stunted around, and he didn't quite catch it in time, so he tried to reach out to get him and was late. The quarterback was able to get away from the rush, but that could have been a problem, and that was definitely on him. And later on in the game, actually not too long after that, a similar stunt happened, and he just wiped that guy out. So he's not a guy that's rattled. He seems like a guy who, if he has a bad play, he forgets about it pretty quick and he just moves on. He did play a few snaps at left tackle in this game also. Wasn't as good in this game as he was against Arizona State. As a left tackle, he was playing against Trent Murphy against Stanford, who obviously is a more highly rated defensive end. And Trent Murphy beat him badly a couple times when he was playing tackle, particularly on some inside moves. And I think it had to do kind of with his struggles against speed, and not being in that box as the interior and being more out in space, so the defender has more room to work with, because that's definitely not his strength. So you definitely saw more of his potential weaknesses when he was playing tackle in this game versus what he did in Arizona State. Basically what it told me was that if he plays tackle, I think you'd be better served putting him on the right side, and not trying to throw him in at the left. And again, would have to be taught, coached up a little bit on the footwork and technique if you were ever to try and make him a long-term option as a tackle. Because right now I just don't think, technique-wise with the feet and the overall technique of bend and leverage, he'd be good enough to play tackle right now in the NFL, particularly left tackle. I definitely think this guy's a guard. I don't think there's any way, unless the Cowboys trade back in the first round, that this guy will be a legitimate option, because I don't think he's going to be graded highly enough to go around 16, and I think even if he was there, probably there's higher rated guys that are available, and I don't think he makes it to our pick in the second round. If he's there in the second round, I definitely think that's a discussion you have to have, because he's probably going to be one of the higher rated guys there, and he could easily be a fill-in at guard, potentially make Bernardo expendable, or kind of make a competition with him and Leary. Because again, with Leary, the knee is always going to be a question mark, I think. So this guy could definitely be a very intriguing option, especially if he makes it there in the second. But I think this guy will be a solid guard from everything that I saw. And then the center. So this guy, I chose Marcus Martin out of USC. He's kind of a center and guard. He played guard his first couple years with the Trojans and then was a center this last year. This was a guy who, unlike with the tackle with Billy Turner, I wasn't quite sure what to think and had him in one spot, and he really impressed me. Or Su'a-Filo, where he kind of was exactly where I thought he would be. Martin was a guy who I kind of had pegged in the, maybe an early third round option, and kind of disappointed me a little bit in the games that I watched. I watched him against Stanford and then against Notre Dame. Not everything was bad. I'm not saying he was played horrible. He does show some good power at the point of attack. You see him get himself with too much reach and overextension more often than not, a lot of times. And the defensive tackles he's going against were able to really get him off his spot and get him off balance, and able to kind of pressure the quarterback a lot more often than you'd want to see. Another play I saw, he used some really bad leverage on an inside run. Defensive tackle was able to just get around him with ease and get the running back right at the line of scrimmage. But then later on, he was able to use really good technique on an inside run and seal off his man, and they broke off a huge run. So he knows what he needs to do. He just doesn't always... He seems like maybe he doesn't always get there in time, or maybe he'll panic at some point and try and do a little bit too much, and hence the tend to overreach and that kind of thing. He does show some good knowledge of what he needs to do, though, in terms of when he's able to kind of ease off helping the guard on a combo block, or needs to pick up a late rusher, that kind of thing. Sometimes you kind of see him standing around a little bit too much for my liking, if maybe he didn't have a rusher right on top of him and he just kind of looking around, and where he could have probably helped one of the guards a little bit more. So that's something he should probably work on. Definitely he's better against the more one technique nose tackle types who aren't trying to get up the field. He struggles against speed and quick twitch defensive tackles. But when he gets on his guy, like particularly a one technique or a nose, which we'll get to when I watch the Notre Dame tape, he can get his hands on him. He can get good position on him if he's head up on a guy, and he can show good power, and he can hold his spot. But against speed, he can struggle with his technique, struggle with balance. So that's a little bit of an off-putting trait for him right now. I would say as a note, he does look like he's got a frame to put on some additional weight. The sites I've seen have him at 320, which he doesn't look that big on film. If he is, then he's more of a lean 320. But I'd say he looks like he could probably, with some good strength and conditioning, add some weight, add some strength, and I think he's going to need that. I think right now, with good coaching, he could for sure be a backup at center and probably a backup at guard for sure. Maybe be groomed into being a starting guard. Because of some of his struggles, I'm not sure I see him as a legitimate starting center in the NFL. I think he'd be better suited as a backup. But definitely he could be a guy, because of his experience, who could be a swing backup at all three of the interior positions, which is a good thing to have when you're working on cutting down your roster. His game against Notre Dame, this one he looked better, but he still showed some of those off plays. On one play, he kind of ran right past the defender he was supposed to block, and then I think realized it at the last second and tried to reach out and block him, and that didn't work at all, and that looked horrible. But he spent most of this game basically head up on Louis Nix, the defensive tackle from Notre Dame. And he actually handled him very well for the majority of this game. Pretty much stonewalled him for the most part. Really good job on a goal line play, getting good leverage and getting underneath the pads of Louis Nix and kind of driving him off the play for a touchdown on a touchdown run. Some good technique again, doing some combo blocking with the guard and moving up to the second level. What I'd say to kind of go back a little bit to what I was saying before on where he looks better, it kind of seems like if the defensive players kind of react to a play the way that it was kind of drawn up or the way that he expects, he seems to do a really good job. He struggles more when he has to kind of improvise, maybe if the defense doesn't quite do what they were expecting, and that kind of thing. And if the man he's assigned to block isn't quite in the right position where he expects him to be, he can tend to overreach a little bit or have some technique or balance issues. So probably not the greatest report card to give out on a guy, but that's just what I saw. He did against Notre Dame, though, to sum up, he did for playing one-on-one the majority of the game against Louis Nix, who's not exactly a scrub. He's definitely a decently rated defensive tackle and nose tackle type. He did a pretty good job, on those one-on-one opportunities. So I initially kind of had him pegged probably somewhere in the third round. And, I could maybe see him still going in the third somewhere if somebody needs a guy with guard and center experience. Wouldn't shock me, though, to see him maybe still around as low as the fifth. And that sounds bad, but it's just I saw too much stuff that's a little bit disconcerting, which I didn't really remember seeing a whole lot when I was watching USC, because as I mentioned before, I watch a lot of USC games. And I did notice when I was watching some of these again that his right guard was helping him a lot. And maybe that's why I didn't notice as many issues. But I hope he goes a little bit higher for his sake. And initially he was a guy I was kind of hoping we might look at in the third or fourth to kind of be that backup center and backup guard. I wouldn't mind if it's somewhere in the fourth to fifth now, looking at him. But probably not higher than that based on what I saw, unless, our coaches think they can really coach up some of that technique stuff. And maybe being a backup or maybe just focusing on guard might help him. Unfortunately, none of the game film I saw had him at guard. It was all center. So I would have liked to see him at guard, because maybe that would have changed my tune on him a little bit. But, watch his stuff and see what you think. Again, I'm watching a lot of these things on, I can't remember the website offhand. Been a long night, but I'll put the link in the description down there. So lastly, I did another mock draft on the fanspeak site, the mock draft simulator. Went 5 rounds this time. Probably went a little bit high on the defensive line in this draft, which I don't think most people would be too opposed to. And I did this mostly based off of the players that were left or that were still on the board and the ratings and such. Just going to kind of give you who I picked this time. I'm not going to go through the whole list of who was available. I'll say who I picked, and if it seems a little odd, kind of maybe a brief reasoning why. So, round one, went with Mike Evans, the receiver out of Texas A&M. Most of Cowboy fans' popular top choices for this pick were already gone. There were a couple of offensive linemen there, but I just couldn't bring myself to take an offensive lineman when a guy rated as high as Mike Evans was there. And this was kind of more of a player ranking choice versus a need for me. So I went with Mike Evans. Second round, went with Scott Crichton, defensive end. Seen a lot of good stuff about him, read a lot of good reports, and seems like a solid defensive end prospect. So I thought he'd be a good pick there. Round three, Trent Murphy, defensive end out of Stanford. So this would be two straight defensive ends. When I got to this point in the third round, the highest rated players that were still left on the board were pretty much all defensive ends. And Murphy was a guy who's shown some good pass rush ability and was probably the most highly rated defensive end left at that point. And it can never hurt to get more depth along the defensive line. Fourth round, defensive line again. I went with Will Sutton, defensive tackle, Arizona State. So again, just more defensive line depth. Obviously, earlier in the draft, I wasn't able to get Donald at defensive tackle, so Will Sutton gives us another 3 technique. Kind of going along with that whole thing where we aren't really sure what's going to happen with Melton, whether this is going to be that 1-year deal or whether he's going to do enough to garner the 3-year option after that. So even if he does, can't hurt to have another guy to bring in as a rotational guy on the line, and especially fourth round, I think he'd be a great value there. And then round 5, Aaron Murray, quarterback, Georgia, still on the board, so I grabbed him. Really good value, I think, if he was still there in the 5th round. Like I mentioned, I did the report on him last week, and I definitely think if his knee checks out, if he was still around in the 5th round, something would be terribly wrong, and it would be a no-brainer, in my opinion, to snatch him up as a backup quarterback, because I would have no doubt that he could probably beat out Whedon and possibly even beat out Orton. And we still don't know really for sure whether Orton's going to stay or go. We've heard Stephen Jones say that he's going to stay, but we've heard nothing from Orton himself, so that's still a wait and see. But if a guy like Murray's still there in the 5th, I think you got to grab him. So that's it for this week. Next week I'll start on defense. I'll probably do some couple defensive ends or defensive tackles. Do another mock draft simulator. And we'll go from there. So we're getting closer and closer to the draft. Only about, it's April 1st today, so just over a month away. So should have, in those remaining weeks, enough time to get through the rest of the positions. And then maybe I'll give you, I don't know. We'll see what happens the week of the draft, what I decide to do. Maybe I'll try and go back to some positions I've done already and look at some maybe lower ranked under the radar guys. But that's it for tonight. So again, check out my other Cowboy vlogs, hit subscribe, leave a comment, hit me up on Twitter if you want to talk Cowboys, and that's it. So have a good night. Go Cowboys.